Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 15th anniversary celebration for the Morgridge Center for Public Service. For those of you who are just joining us for the second half of our celebration, earlier this afternoon we really had a wonderful session with the rollout of the Wisconsin Without Borders initiative, our brand new partnership on campus between the Division of International Studies, the Global Health Institute, and the Morgridge Center for Public Service, and our effort to begin a new program on campus that is focused on international service learning. And we heard wonderful stories and events that the students were involved in with their service learning all around the world, and I just have to say how proud I am of the students and their faculty mentors for the wonderful work they're doing. Clearly it represents long-term investments, long-term partnerships that are formed based on long-term trust. So hopefully some of you heard that, and welcome to this afternoon session. For our next portion of our program, we're honored to hear perspectives about the role that civic engagement plays in higher education at the 5,000-foot level from Chancellor David Ward. We'll move on from there to hear about the perspectives about the founding of the Morgridge Center for Public Service from both John and Tasha Morgridge. And again, with this 15th year anniversary, we have much to be thankful for, and clearly we are all very thankful for John and Tasha's support over the years. We will conclude our afternoon program with our keynote address by speakers Bob and Sarah Rothschild, who will share with us their vision and experiences with their foundation initiative, Building Village Libraries in Botswana. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Interim Chancellor David Ward. Chancellor Ward returned to the helm as Chancellor at UW-Madison in July 2011, having previously served in the position between 1993 and 2000. Chancellor Ward has many, many accolades on which I could focus, but what I really want to highlight right now is evidence of his true commitment to the Wisconsin idea and his commitment to the public service mission of the land-grant universities. During his chancellorship in the 1990s, Chancellor Ward was a champion for reinvigorating the Wisconsin idea by building connections among and between the university, city, county, and state. He led the creation of the UW-Madison Cluster Hire Program aimed at attracting and retaining world-class faculty engaged in interdisciplinary scholarship and created the university's Technology Transfer Council in 1995. Perhaps most importantly to us, he charged a now historic committee in 1994, co-chaired by a current Dean of the College of Letters and Sciences, Gary Sandifer, and former Dean of Student, Mary Rouse, to prepare a proposal for the establishment of a service and service learning center on campus. He strongly supported the team effort of Mary Rouse and Don Gray from the UW Foundation, who sends his regrets that he couldn't be here today, supported the team to initiate a conversation with the Morgridges back in 1994 to first propose the idea of a university-wide service and service learning center. Chancellor Ward has long been an advocate for engaged scholarship, and in 1994 he was part of the CIC's Kellogg Commission that brought together 25 presidents and chancellors of major universities to prepare the report on the future of the land-grant university. It is only fitting that Chancellor Ward has rejoined our campus during our 100th anniversary of the Wisconsin idea, the 15th anniversary of the Morgridge Center. Please join me in welcoming Chancellor David Ward to talk about his vision for higher education.
Well, it's wonderful to be back, and wonderful to be back in a building like this. I've visited many times, but it's the first time I get to address you from this podium, and I've been delighted to see many others speak from this podium, but it really is glorious. The subject of really this afternoon is it can be both broad and narrow. I think its origins lie in the idea of making knowledge useful, not only in a purely practical sense, but also in being creative and creating a dialogue so that the application is not just sort of an empty movement from thought to action, but there's a contemplative element as well. So I think that the use of the word engagement now, rather than outreach or extension or a whole range of other words, we finally got our arms around what the idea is all about. And I think it's the idea of a complete cycle where it's not just application, it's not just feeling pragmatic, it's not just being utilitarian, it is the mental engagement that also goes on in becoming engaged. So engagement is really a state of mind, not just a transfer of knowledge. And I think there's much more understanding of that right now than there was certainly 20 years ago. When I think about that idea and this campus, I have to go back to the accreditation report of 1989. I was a brand new provost. The accreditation process had preceded my term, so I was handed this accreditation report. And although people think accreditation doesn't matter, if you take it seriously, it can matter a great deal. And this one did, because it was actually quite critical of UW-Madison. It actually told us what we claimed to be good at, what we could be good at, and why didn't we get good at it. I mean, that would be actually what I had read that report. And there were several areas that they felt we could do a better job at. One of them was the first 2 years of undergraduate education. Remember, 1989. The idea of interdisciplinarity. All of these things were thought of as important to us, and yet somehow or other they felt they didn't have the enterprise and the energy to pull them off. And one of them was what they called outreach, or the Wisconsin idea, or making knowledge, in a sense, relevant to the state and even further afield. So one of the critiques was, you got something here that's very special. You even call it, arrogantly as it were, the Wisconsin idea, but do you practice it to the degree that is appropriate? So during the 4 or 5 years following that accreditation, I think we took seriously all three of those criticisms. One was obviously doing a better job of undergraduate education. One was to promote interdisciplinarity. And then finally, actually the one that was most difficult to do, and that was to rethink outreach, extension, the Wisconsin idea in whatever that may mean. And the greatest challenge was ambiguity of meaning in the language itself. And the fact that we were in a shift from what had been overwhelmingly a agriculturally grounded extension movement to something which involved more I think, an educational attribute, and above all, it became something that needed to be integrated into the mainstream of how education occurred, that engagement was not something over here. And we began to think differently about teaching, research, public service, outreach, and thinking about how can we create a Venn diagram, and then if you've got very strong arms, can you push those Venn diagrams so they overlap more and more? And I think that was the kind of conceptual idea that lay behind development. We were also very lucky in that I think there were some passionate individuals who wanted to talk about this, and certainly I think Mary Rouse and Gary Sander, who should take some credit, in very quiet ways began to think how we might do this. But even more important, I think, was that it clearly needed a place, and it also needed a better sense of mission. And one of the local events that actually may have helped us think about mission with engagement as education, not just as reaching out, was the plight of the homeless in Madison, who were living by the heating vents of the Peterson building. And some of them were actually threatening people, employees in the building, as they were leaving. And rightly, the students said, as the police began to move them, this is not quite the right way to do this. So I, with the help of the Department of Social Work and city officials, we tried to see what could we do to intervene. Because what was clearly going on was the student idealism was the engagement. Exactly how that engagement would manifest itself in dealing with the homeless was the stretch. So the engagement was now there. They were alert to a need. And it was very interesting that the social services were very worried about getting the students involved. There were safety issues, but also the feeling that altruism by itself, without some sort of professional development, may cause more trouble than it was worth. And so that was one of the early occasions when student volunteers, where did they go? How could they go, in a sense, to move from their altruism to some sort of competency that would allow them to participate effectively with the agencies, or even in their own spontaneous efforts to be helpful. And in fact, the Department of Social Work did develop some short courses and so on. But that was sort of preceding this. And what it demonstrated to us was the need of a clearinghouse, there was a sort of sense of which how would we tailor and customize students to a particular kind of idealism and engagement, and above all, how could we cause groups? Because in the end, engagement, like all good education, is better off when it's done in a sense of a circular dialogue, multilateral dialogue, rather than in a bilateral dialogue, and that the education itself is bound up with the method by which the engagement is being experienced by several different individuals. And I think that was what began to develop as a thought for the Center for Service Learning. There were broader ideas about, which were perhaps more pragmatic, about internships. This was the beginning of the decade when there were worries about the employability of many degrees that had historically been liberal arts degrees, and individuals could quite easily move into professional training in their first job. Increasingly, the world was changing to a situation where some sort of multiple major, combining something that was more applied with something that was in the liberal arts, seemed to be almost necessary as one moves into a world in which jobs seem quite different than they did half a decade earlier. And I think that has been a prophecy that's worked out. It's a very tense world in terms of the fit between education and employment if you narrowly focus just on a discipline. So internships, I think, became one of the lead elements that as a student, through trying to support themselves, might in fact be promoting themselves following the degree. And how could you create an internship system that had educational value and wasn't in fact just simply a way of finding money in the summer? I think a variety of other things that came out of this were obviously alternative spring breaks. There were a whole series of creative ways in which engagement began to express itself. The problem is how did you put it all together in one place? And I think that's where philanthropy came together with a vision in a very propitious moment in the early 90s. And here, I think I've got to say that philanthropy also can be creative. That is, as one tries to see an opportunity to invest in something that has worthwhile purposes, on the whole, it tends to be very directed either at a particular position, a small group of people, a particular department. The great thing that happened here with this gift is it was available to all. Anybody who wished to be engaged, here was something that was at large. And I think donations that have what I call an at-large effect is something that philanthropy needs to think of, that instead of being in a sense of bilateral connection, it really is creating a context in which individuals can then reach either competitively or because of the relevance of them to what's being offered. Need-based aid is often offered in this way. It's a very general idea, but it's available broadly rather than just in one particular place. And I think this was a very unique way in which the gift that came from the Morgridges was very much at large. So it was a creative vision, but it was very much an at-large gift. Lots and lots of people benefited. It was not a narrow gift. It was a very broad gift. That, in many respects, is a very visionary kind of philanthropy. And finally, the other vision was there was an old building, which I come from Manchester, England, and red brick buildings are very familiar. And so when I saw the old red gym in Science Hall, I felt pretty, this is home, lots of red brick. And I went to a red brick university. The Brits call those northern British universities red brick universities because they're not sandstone and limestone like those odd things. Well, the Oxford and Cambridge, I think they're called. They have. So those of us who went to these northern British universities, red brick was familiar. And there was the old red gym or the armory. Being a historian, I actually thought of it as the armory first. Later, I realized it really was the old red gym to most students. But this was a building in disrepair. And to revitalize a building as part of this image through philanthropy, imagine you can see the creativity of this philanthropy. Simultaneously, lots of good things are happening. Rehabilitation of a building that had symbolic meaning, but desperately needed to be remodeled creatively. An at-large gift, lots of people